Welcome to A Father's Accountability. This is a place where quiet men prove that patience is a form of strength. Every story here is about a father who was underestimated, overlooked, or even betrayed by the very people he was supposed to protect, and how he stepped up to make things right. Welcome to today's story. For 38 years, I delivered mail along Willow Bend Street. I used to think I could recognize every front door in that neighborhood with my eyes closed. That was until a Sunday morning when I turned the corner in my church clothes and found one of those doors wide open with an 81-year-old woman's entire life packed into cardboard boxes stacked high on the porch. My name is Jesse Pugh. I'm 76 years old, and I live in Carver Crest in East Houston. I was here long before the modern coffee shops and glass-front condos moved in and decided our neighborhood was valuable. I walked these streets for nearly 4 decades, delivering letters, birthday cards, and the occasional past-due bill until I retired. In all those years on the job, I never encountered a house I couldn't get into, or a door I didn't know by heart. That Sunday, I was walking back from the 10 o'clock service at Mount Zion Church. I was still humming the tune of the closing hymn when I saw a moving truck parked awkwardly by the curb outside the small yellow house on the corner. Before my brain could even process what was happening, my stomach dropped. That house belonged to me. I'd owned it for nearly 20 years. Standing outside was 81-year-old Odell Fairweather. She was wearing her bathrobe, clutching a framed photograph tightly to her chest like she was terrified someone would rip it away from her. She had lived there ever since her husband passed. Her monthly rent was a full $200 below market value because a long time ago I told her that some things matter a whole lot more than money. "Mr. Pugh!" she called out, her voice raspy, caught between relief and sheer panic. She was still in her slippers, a set of rosary beads wrapped twice around her wrist. Behind her, a young man was already carrying out the small bookshelf that used to hold her late husband's pictures. "Mr. Pugh, they told me I only have 30 days. They said the house has a new owner." A young guy in a polo shirt with a real estate logo embroidered over the pocket was taping up a folder by the mailbox, not even looking up. I asked him who sent him. He gave me a name I didn't recognize, from a company I'd never heard of, and said the paperwork had been processed just 2 days ago by a family representative. A family representative. Those words sat heavy in my mouth, and even before I fully understood what they meant, I knew something was wrong. Spending 40 years reading return addresses teaches you a thing or two. You learn to spot a collection agency from a birthday card without ever opening the envelope. My gut told me that whatever kind of business this was, it had been cooked up right inside my own home. I had never sold that house, and I never had any intention to. I bought it back when my wife, Odessa, was still alive, at a time when this street was full of families who couldn't get a bank loan or a properly paved road from the city. I promised myself back then that as long as I was breathing, no one who had earned a quiet piece of peace in their old age would ever be pushed out in the name of progress. I told the young man there had to be a mistake. I told him I was the owner and that my signature wasn't on any paperwork because I hadn't signed a thing. He looked at me the way people look at an old man they've already decided is losing his grip. He told me the documents were legally filed, and if I had a problem, I should go home and talk to my family. My family. I helped Odell move 2 of her boxes back inside and told her not to touch another thing until I sorted this out. I squeezed her hand because it was shaking even harder than mine. Then I walked the 4 blocks back to my house faster than I had in a decade, my heart hammering a rhythm that didn't feel right. Carver Crest doesn't look the way it used to. Half the homes on my old mail route have been bought up, gutted, painted gray, and flipped for prices the original owners couldn't even dream of. I don't mind new faces moving in. What I mind is watching the old ones get quietly pushed out, one signature at a time, until nobody left remembers why the street was called Willow Bend in the first place. For 20 years, using a mailman's modest retirement fund, I bought up every small house I could afford and rented them out cheap to people like Odell. I watched these folks raise their grandkids here, and I just wanted to make sure a few doors on this street would never have a for sale sign on them. I thought I had protected it all. I thought After everything, I had built something that couldn't be taken away. By the time I reached my own porch, my hands were shaking, and it had nothing to do with my age. My son Dante's car was in the driveway. His wife Kelly's car was there too. Through the front window, I could see them both sitting in the living room. There was a strange stillness to the room, and even though they must have heard my boots on the porch, neither of them moved toward the door. That silence told me everything before I even touched the brass handle. Whatever happened to Odell Fairweather's house started right here in my own home. I stood there for a long moment, my hand resting on the knob I'd installed myself, the summer we bought the place. In 38 years on this street, there had never been a door I couldn't open. Then I turned the handle and stepped inside to find out exactly what my family had done. The moment I crossed the threshold, the living room fell completely silent. It was a heavy kind of quiet, the kind that tells you everything of substance had already been said before you walked in. An open folder lay on the coffee table between them. The documents inside were fanned out neatly, almost as if they were laid out for a photograph. Next to them sat a business card I didn't recognize, printed on the kind of expensive, heavy cream paper that costs a pretty penny. Nobody looked surprised to see me standing in the doorway. They looked like people who had been waiting for a long time. Dante stood by the fireplace, his eyes glued to the rug, as if it could tell him what to say. Kelly sat on the edge of the sofa, her hands folded in her lap. She looked at me the way you look at a pot you know is just about to boil over. I didn't raise my voice. 38 years of knocking on strangers' doors teaches you that raising your voice gets you nowhere. A steady tone is what carries you through. I quietly asked them what on earth was going on with Odell Fairweather's house. I asked who had the authority on a Sunday morning to send a man with a clipboard and a moving truck to an elderly woman's porch. Dante opened his mouth, closed it, and then did it again, looking exactly like someone rehearsing a line he couldn't quite bring himself to say out loud. It was Kelly who answered, and her response sounded like she'd been waiting for me to ask that question all morning. "Dad," she said, "we didn't want you to find out this way. We were planning on all three of us sitting down to have a real talk about this later today." "Find out what?" I asked her. She reached across the coffee table and slid the thick folder toward me. The first page bore the county clerk's stamp in the corner. She told me that 2 weeks ago, after I'd fainted in my garden on a hot Houston afternoon, Dante had been so worried about my condition that he went to a lawyer. The lawyer helped them file for what she called emergency financial conservatorship. I remembered that afternoon clearly. I'd been pulling weeds past noon, hadn't had enough water, and just sat down on the grass to catch my breath. A neighbor 2 doors down saw me from her porch, panicked, and called Dante. But I was back on my feet within 20 minutes, feeling far more embarrassed than unwell. By dinner time, I was sitting on my own porch, sipping sweet tea. "That wasn't a medical crisis," I told them. "That was just an old man forgetting to drink water on a hot day." Dante finally looked up. "Dad, it was terrifying," he said, his voice weaker than I remembered it. "You were down on the ground. When I called your name, you didn't answer. Not at first." I asked him what the connection was between a man not drinking enough water in his own yard and signing over control of my finances to a lawyer we'd never even met. Then I asked the more important question. I asked how a piece of paper filed just 3 days ago could have already traveled 4 blocks over to a rental property and landed in the hands of a real estate agent I'd never seen before. That house hadn't even been mentioned in the petition the judge agreed to hear. I wanted to know who had connected those 2 dots and why it all happened before I even knew there was anything to connect. Kelly's smile didn't waver, but the calculation behind her eyes shifted. She said the filing gave Dante temporary signing authority over any property in my name, effective the moment it was submitted. She claimed the agent handling Odell's house must have just been notified as a matter of routine procedure. She spoke in the tone of someone reciting pages they'd memorized by heart, rather than saying words they actually believed. I didn't believe a word of it, even if I couldn't spot the exact lie just yet. Kelly's voice remained even, almost gentle, the way you speak to a child throwing a tantrum. "The conservatorship is just precautionary," she said. "It gives us the legal standing to manage things properly if your health really does decline." The situation with Ms. Weatherweather is just a misunderstanding by an overeager agent getting ahead of the paperwork. I'll personally go down there tomorrow morning and straighten it out. I asked her when the judge was going to hear the case. She told me the hearing was set for 12 days from now at the Harris County Courthouse. Furthermore, a court-appointed evaluator, an expert she had already spoken with personally, would be coming by later that same week to assess what she called my current capacity. 12 days. I turned that number over in my mind the way I used to flip through a faded address on an old route, looking for the street where it belonged. Dante wouldn't look me in the eye now. He had completely retreated behind his wife's calm, steady voice, the way a man retreats behind a locked door when he no longer trusts his own hand on the knob. Kelly stood up from the sofa, smoothed down her skirt, and walked across the room with the folder, gently pressing it into my hands. Her fingers felt cold against mine. "We're just trying to protect you, Dad," she said, her eyes soft, her voice filled with something that could almost pass for love. "That's all this has ever been about. You believe that, right?" Later that evening, when the house had grown quiet and Dante and Kelly had gone upstairs, I sat alone at the kitchen table. The unsigned conservatorship papers were still sitting out in front of me, but I found myself looking past them toward the photographs on the wall. Odessa and I had been married for 50 years before God took her home 6 years ago. In that photograph, she was 22, wearing a borrowed white dress and laughing at something just out of frame. Her hand was resting lightly on my arm as if she already knew exactly how the next 50 years were going to play out. I couldn't remember what she was laughing at anymore. I just remembered deciding right then and there that I was going to spend the rest of my life trying to earn that smile again. It was Odessa who taught me the true value of a house. It wasn't the number a bank put on it. It was the number of Sundays it held, the number of grandkids who learned to walk on its floors. 3 years after we were married, an elderly widow, living 2 doors down from our first little rental, got notice that her rent was doubling. Odessa marched right over there with a pound cake, and when she came home an hour later, she had calmly promised the lady we'd do whatever it took to help out. We couldn't do much back then. We were scraping by ourselves. But I never forgot the look on Odessa's face that night, like she'd found the one thing in this world worth fighting for besides me. After she passed, I kept using my mailman's retirement fund to buy up every small house I could afford, one by one, renting them out for prices that made my accountant shake his head every tax season. Some years I could manage one. Some years, with a little overtime, I could manage two. I had never explained the whole truth of it to Dante. He had grown up watching his mother care for this neighborhood, and he seemed to think my persistence was just a habit, an old coat I wore out of sentiment rather than conviction. He never understood that to me, every deed I signed was just a way of continuing a conversation with a woman who wasn't in the room anymore. Dinner that evening had been a quiet, careful affair, the kind of dinner where everyone is a little too polite passing the butter, because if the room stays quiet for too long, nobody knows what might spill out. Arya sat across from me, picking at her rice. She was only 17, but she had the eyes of a 40-year-old, watching her parents with the kind of caution girls learn before they learn anything else. Dante had barely spoken, moving his food around his plate with an absent-minded care, looking like a man trying to balance a budget in his head that just wouldn't add up. Kelly tried to fill the silence, the way she always did, with words that sounded warm on the surface but never reached the center of the room. She steered the conversation toward the neighborhood, the new coffee shop 2 streets over, the young couples moving in with renovation budgets. Then she said something that caught Dante's fork in midair. "It really is a shame when you think about it," she said, "leaving all those properties just sitting there collecting dust for pennies, when the whole block is worth 3 times what it was 5 years ago. People get so sentimental about a few old structures, but at a certain point, sentimentality is just leaving money on the table." For a moment, nobody spoke. Kelly must have felt it, because she let out a short, sharp laugh and reached across to squeeze my hand. "I'm just teasing, Dad," she said. "You know I love this old block as much as you do." I didn't believe that either, though I said nothing, letting the moment pass, because 76 years have taught me one thing. The things people say when they're laughing are sometimes the truest things they'll say all day. When the dishes were cleared, Arya lingered in the kitchen while I dried the last of the plates, hovering the way she used to when she was little and had something on her mind too heavy to carry alone. I asked her what was bothering her. She told me that a few days ago, while she was sitting in the car waiting for her mother to run an errand, she saw Kelly in a parking lot outside a cafe on Alameda Road. She was meeting a man in a gray suit, someone Arya had never seen before. The two of them were leaning in close, talking for a long time over something Kelly was keeping inside a manila envelope. She said the man never raised his voice, and he never smiled. The entire exchange happened in this intense, quiet way, the kind of quiet that only happens when two people have already agreed on something and are just hashing out the final details. I slowly set my dish towel down on the counter. A feeling in my chest went completely still and sharp all at once. It was the exact same feeling I used to get on slow afternoons sorting mail, when one envelope in a stack felt just a fraction heavier than it had any right to be. I asked her if she heard what they said. She shook her head, but she told me that just an hour before dinner, she was walking past her mother's half-open bedroom door and heard Kelly speak 5 words in a low, absolute tone that stuck with her. 5 words that didn't make sense until she saw my face at the dinner table tonight. "Don't worry," Arya told me. "He won't be a problem." It took me 3 days to build up the nerve to look for what I was fairly certain I didn't want to find. Kelly went out that Thursday morning for what she called a hair appointment, though she came back looking exactly the same as when she left. That was another little thing I started noticing after the night Arya stood in my kitchen with dish soap on her hands. Dante was at his dwindling office, chasing numbers that never seemed to balance out the way he needed them to. For the first time in I couldn't remember how long, the house was mine, alone. I stood in the hallway outside the room they used as an office, and I forced my feet to move inside. I'm not proud of what I did next. A man who has spent 76 years believing privacy is a sacred right doesn't rifle through his daughter-in-law's things without a heavy chest. But I kept seeing that cream-colored business card on my coffee table, the one nobody in the room bothered to explain, and I kept hearing Arya's 5 words in my head like a hymn I couldn't stop humming. I found the folder in the very bottom drawer of Kelly's desk, tucked under a stack of yoga catalogs she never seemed to buy anything from. It was thick and official, the kind of document a company spends real money to print, rather than running it off a basic copier. At the top, in raised gold lettering, it read Woodward Development Group, and right below that was a name I knew, the kind of name you hear around the edges of the neighborhood for years, but never actually touch directly. Judson Woodward. I'd heard the name in the barber shop, in the church pews from time to time. People talked about him in low tones, a man who bought up 6 blocks on the west side of the city and left a trail of ruined small business owners in his wake as he pushed his projects through. I thought about Ronnie Castellanos, who used to run a tire shop on Scott Street until Woodward Development bought up the entire block around him, leaving Ronnie isolated behind a chain-link fence with promises of a renewed lease that never came. Ronnie used to say Woodward looked him dead in the eye and called him a valued partner, less than 2 weeks before the lawyer's letters arrived to end it all. People said Judson Woodward was the kind of man who would shake your hand until he had no more use for you, and after that, he wouldn't even remember your name. Inside the folder was a letter of intent dated 3 weeks prior. It wasn't addressed to Dante Pugh or the Pugh family, but directly to Kelly Pugh, forwarded through an email address I didn't recognize. The letter outlined a proposal to acquire 4 residential properties on Willow Bend Street, listing the exact addresses. Every single one was a house I owned. Houses I had spent 20 years keeping, filled with people the city had once tried to push out. Folded inside the front cover was a sticky note. Kelly's slanted, frantic handwriting had written a few words, underlined twice. Must move by Friday. I read the letter twice, my fingers tracing the lines the way I used to decipher addresses in someone's hurried handwriting, looking for the shape of the truth beneath the ink. There wasn't a single word in those pages about protecting an old man. Nothing about conservatorship, health, or capacity. Not one word. Just valuations, expected returns, and a signature line that was still waiting, sitting there like a spider, patiently waiting for someone to put my name on it. I sat down slowly in Kelly's office chair, the folder open in my lap, letting the truth settle into my bones. It felt like cold water seeping into your boots, where you can feel it climbing up your legs before you even realize you're wet. I had spent 3 days without saying it to myself out loud, assuming that whatever trouble was coming to this house would have my son's name on it. Dante was the one drowning in debt. Dante was the one who flinched every time the phone rang. It had never occurred to me that the hand steering this ship toward my 4 houses might not belong to my son at all. And for the first time since that Sunday morning outside Odell's house, I began to wonder if my own son knew any more than I did about what his wife was truly capable of. I closed the folder exactly as I'd found it, slid it back under the yoga catalog she never looked at, and shut the drawer without a sound. I straightened the chair, smoothed out the tracks my shoes had left in the rug, and walked out of that room the way I came in, careful, like a man diffusing something that could take his hands off if he breathed too heavy. That evening I sat across from Kelly at the dinner table, listening to her give a play-by-play of her hair appointment that included more details than I had ever asked for. I nodded along, asking polite questions about the salon. My hand didn't shake, and my voice didn't waver, though inside my chest a fire had been lit that no amount of politeness was ever going to put out. Don't let them know you know, I told myself, not yet. Around midnight, when I couldn't lie in bed any longer, I reached into the drawer of my nightstand and pulled out an address book. It was a book I'd kept for so long that most of the numbers inside didn't work anymore. The leather cover was soft and dark from 40 years of handling, the pages the color of strong tea. I flipped past names I hadn't called in a decade. Past Odessa's handwriting, she used to correct my spelling of people's last names in the margins, until I found the one I was looking for under the letter S, Quentin Small. Quentin and I had served together back when we both had good knees and less sense than God gave a goose. We'd buried each other's fathers and stood as best men at each other's weddings. Years ago, when Quentin's truck broke down outside of Beaumont, the two of them drove 11 hours through the night just so Quentin could make his daughter's graduation. In the 50 years since basic training, he was the kind of friend a man only gets 2 or 3 of in a lifetime. The kind who doesn't ask why you're calling in the middle of the night, only asks if you're safe first, and then asks what you need. He answered on the 3rd ring, his voice thick with sleep and a little startled. I told him I was sorry to wake him so late. I told him I needed to talk to him about the arrangement we made 8 years ago, the one we both quietly hoped I'd never have to use. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. When Quentin spoke again, the sleep was entirely gone from his voice. "Are you serious, Jesse?" he said. "You aren't pulling my leg?" I told him I was as serious as a heart attack. 8 years ago, shortly after Odessa's heart first started giving her trouble, I spent a lot of nights lying awake, thinking about what would happen to everything we built if I left before I had a chance to properly secure it. I went to a lawyer with an idea that Quentin thought was half genius and half foolishness. Then the 3 of us quietly, carefully, built something into my estate paperwork that I had spent the last 8 years praying would never have a reason to wake up. I didn't explain the details to Quentin that night. He already knew them better than I did. I just needed to hear him say the words. "It's all still there," he told me. "Every bit of it. Just say the word." I thanked him, told him I'd be in touch soon, and hung up before either of us could get sentimental. My next call went to Thomas Whitaker, the attorney who had drawn up that agreement 8 years ago. Whitaker isn't the kind of lawyer who advertises on the side of a city bus. Quentin was the one who found him for me. He's a quiet, careful man who has spent 30 years doing the kind of tedious, airtight work that never makes the evening news, but never has to be done twice. These days I trusted him with things I wouldn't dream of putting into my own son's hands. He answered groggy but alert, a good lawyer's instinct. I asked him just one question, whether the paperwork we filed all those years ago was still fully in effect, exactly as we left it. "It is, Mr. Pugh," he said. "Not a single line has changed. Has something happened?" I told him I'd explain everything soon, but right now I needed him ready to move the moment I called back. When I finally stepped into the hallway, I found Arya awake too. She was sitting at the top of the stairs in her socks, the way she used to when she was little, and the house felt too big and quiet for her to sleep. I sat down next to her and pressed a small piece of plastic into her palm. It was a prepaid flip phone I'd bought with cash at a pharmacy 3 towns over the week before, back when I wasn't even entirely sure what I was preparing for. "Keep it charged and keep it hidden," I told her. "If you ever need me and you can't use your own phone, this is how you reach me. Don't tell your mother about it. Don't tell your father either. Not yet." She looked down at the phone, then up at me, asking flat out what was going on. "One day I'll tell you everything," I told her. "Tonight, I just need you to believe that your granddad hasn't been sitting in this house doing nothing all these years." She nodded slowly, slid the phone into her pajama pocket, and gave me the tightest, longest hug I'd had in a long time before padding back down the hall to her room. After she left, I stood by the window for a long time, looking out over Carver Crest, out at the streets I'd carried a mailbag across for 38 years. 38 years teaches a man where every crack in the sidewalk is, which dogs bark, and which porch lights stay burned out too long because nobody's left to fix them. But it doesn't teach you how to sit still when you finally realize that the danger to everything you love didn't come from those streets at all, but was already living under your own roof, sleeping at the end of the hall, and calling you Dad. The doorbell rang at exactly 10 o'clock on Tuesday morning, right on time. That was 3 days after I gave Arya the little phone. I knew before I even reached the door that whoever was standing on the outside was sent to gather pieces to use against me. She introduced herself as Dr. Renata Kessler, a specialist in elderly cognition, though she never once offered to show any identification to prove it. I never asked for it either. A man who has decided to play dumb can't afford to look too smart about the details. She carried a brown leather briefcase that was the exact same shade as the folder I'd found in Kelly's desk. Seeing that color twice in 1 week inside my own house sat in my stomach like a stone I'd swallowed whole. Kelly greeted her at the door like an old friend, guided her into the living room with warm hands and a low voice. 2 chairs had already been set up facing each other, close enough that a person being questioned had nowhere comfortable to look but straight into the interrogator's eyes. Dr. Kessler opened her briefcase and pulled out a clipboard. For the next hour, she asked me questions in a specific rhythm, the rhythm of someone who already knew the answers she wanted and was just watching to see how long it took me to fail to give them. She asked me the date. I gave it to her straight. She asked me to name the current president, and then the one before that. I gave her both names without a hitch, but I took care to leave just enough of a pause between the answers, making it sound like a man remembering, rather than a man being careful. Then she asked me to count backward from 100 by sevens, out loud, without stopping. I did it slower than I could have, slower than I'd ever counted change or sorted mail on the move for 38 years, because I'd decided about 3 questions and that my safest position in this house was 1 step behind where they expected me to be. She asked me to draw a clock face from memory and set the time to 11 minutes past 10. I made the circle a little crooked on purpose, squeezed the numbers on the right just a fraction too close together, not enough for any honest doctor to call it a problem, but enough to give a dishonest one something to circle with a red pen later. She asked me how my moods had been lately, and I told her fine, though fine covers a whole lot of territory in a short sentence. Twice during that hour, Kelly chimed in, speaking in a soft, worried tone about little incidents where I'd supposedly failed to remember things clearly. Incidents I had no memory of because, as far as I knew, they had never happened. It was her 7th or 8th question that told me the real purpose of the appointment. "Mr. Pugh, do you ever feel," she asked, her pen already moving before I'd even started to answer, "that the people closest to you might be trying to take advantage of you in some way?" I looked at Kelly, who was sitting on the arm of the sofa, her hand pressed to her chest with an expression made entirely of worry and none of it real. I thought about the folder in her desk drawer. I thought about Arya's 5 words. In 76 years, I have never wanted to say yes so badly in my life. just to see what Kelly's carefully arranged face would look like when the pieces didn't fall where she'd placed them. Instead, I told Dr. Kessler that I had a wonderful family who probably worried about me more than I deserved, and that any man my age who didn't feel a little uncertain about the future wasn't paying close enough attention to it. She wrote something down that I couldn't see. By the end of the hour, my head was aching from the effort of trying to look tired instead of sharp. Dr. Kessler closed her folder with the satisfaction of a woman who had gotten what she came for, even if she didn't care what I'd actually said to give it to her. She told Kelly, not me, that the results suggested a need for continued observation, and that in these situations, families often found it helpful to have a trained care assistant in the home during the day, someone to offer support and provide gentle oversight until the court date arrived. Kelly thanked her, a tear catching in the corner of her eye that never quite fell. I knew that kind of tear now. It's the kind you see when you've been shown where the extra cards are kept, and you see right through the magic trick. Dr. Kessler left a business card on the coffee table before she walked out, the same brown color as her briefcase. She told us a young woman named Denise would be arriving Friday morning to begin what she called a period of supportive routine care. I knew exactly what it meant. Friday, they were sending someone to watch me. I walked Dr. Kessler to the door myself and thanked her for her time. That was the rule my mother taught me, to thank whoever crossed my threshold. After her car pulled away, I stood on the porch for a minute, counting the days left until court, the way I used to count the houses left on a route. 9 days. 9 days, and a stranger named Denise would be arriving on Friday to ensure I couldn't use any of them wisely. The morning after Denise moved in, the hook by the back door where I'd hung my truck keys for 11 years was empty. For one confused second I stood there patting my pockets, like a man looking for his own reflection after the mirror on the wall had vanished overnight. Denise found me standing there a few minutes later. She'd been living with us for nearly a week by then. She'd arrived that first Friday with a small suitcase, her manners careful and very quiet. I knew immediately that she'd done this specific job in other houses before mine. She was young, younger than Arya's mother, with tired eyes and a clipboard of her own tucked under her arm, though her clipboard held thin official papers, different from Dr. Kessler's, the papers of someone who was just doing a job, rather than building a case against a man. She brought me a cup of coffee before I could even ask. There was a kindness in her efficiency that told me she'd learned, in those other houses, that a little decency didn't cost anything, and sometimes made a hard job easier to bear. Later, watching her hands move a little unsteadily around the coffee pot, I decided Denise wasn't my enemy. She was just someone's employee, standing exactly where the money told her to stand. I asked her in the calmest voice I could muster if she'd seen my truck keys. She didn't quite look me in the eye when she told me that Kelly had mentioned the truck needed servicing, and that it had been taken to the shop this morning, while I was still asleep upstairs. She spoke with the careful cadence of someone delivering a message they'd been told to say but privately doubted. I didn't press her on it. 76 years has taught me enough to know that crowding the messenger usually just gets you a more careful messenger next time, and a more careful messenger tells you even less than the first one. It was while walking through the kitchen that I noticed the second thing that had gone missing from my life that morning. That small brass mailbox key had hung on my ring since the day I retired. I only kept it out of sentiment, not need, since it had been years since I'd been in any rush to check my own mail. But now it didn't open anything at all. Over the last 2 days, someone had installed a brand new lock on that roadside mailbox. When I brought it up to Denise, she avoided my gaze again. She told me Kelly was now the only one with a key, muttering some excuse about consolidating important documents during a stressful time to make sure nothing got lost or misdirected. When you spend 38 years putting mail into people's hands, you understand what a locked box really signifies. It doesn't mean your mail is secure. It means someone has decided you can no longer be trusted with your own letters. It's a specific, quiet kind of theft, the sort that never shows up on a police report. I thought back to the folder I'd found in Kelly's desk drawer 9 days earlier, the paperwork for the Woodward Development Group, and that empty signature line patiently waiting for my name like a spider in a web. A locked mailbox and a borrowed truck might seem like minor things on their own. It would be easy to explain them away to a judge as simple, protective measures for an aging man. But when small things are stacked together carefully enough and quickly enough, they become a wall. The wall is built before the person inside even realizes they've been fenced in. A little later, I was standing by the kitchen window, trying to figure out how I was going to contact Quentin or Whitaker, with my truck gone and my phone likely monitored. That's when I heard Kelly's voice coming from the hallway. It was sharp and low, a tone I had never heard her use before. It was completely different from the sweet voice she used at the dinner table or with the doctor. I couldn't catch most of what she was saying. The sound broke apart through the drywall. I heard a name I didn't recognize, something about a timeline, and something about Friday not being soon enough. Just before her voice dropped too low to hear, I caught one last fragment. 4 words that didn't make sense to me then, but played on a loop in my head for the rest of the day. He still doesn't know. The line went dead. A moment later, I heard the click of her heels coming back toward the kitchen. Her voice had already shifted back into that familiar, gentle cadence before she even rounded the corner and saw me. I didn't have any real proof yet. All I had was a locked mailbox, a missing truck, and a voice I'd just heard through the wall that didn't belong to the woman now smiling at me, asking if I'd had breakfast. I tore a small corner off a grocery receipt in my pocket. Using the stubby pencil I kept for crosswords, I wrote a few words down. I folded it twice and squeezed it in my fist, tight enough to feel the sharp corners biting into my palm. I waited for the next moment Arya and I might be alone in a room together, away from Denise's watchful eyes, to figure out exactly what those 4 words meant. On Saturday morning, Arya showed up carrying a backpack full of algebra homework she had absolutely no intention of doing. Her presence told me right away that she understood exactly what this visit needed to look like from the outside. Denise let her in with a polite smile, then headed back into the kitchen to finish whatever she was doing. She was close enough to hear us if we raised our voices, but not close enough to pay attention to a normal conversation. Arya sat down at the table, opened her textbook to a page of equations, and asked me if I remembered how to do long division, speaking loud enough for anyone listening to hear. I sat down across from her and took her pencil. As I solved a math problem I didn't need any help with, I slid the folded corner of the receipt across the table under my palm. My hands weren't as steady as they used to be. Passing a note without getting caught required a kind of nerve I hadn't used since I was a young man, sneaking love letters to Odessa under her mother's watchful eye. Denise's footsteps paused in the hallway, close enough to make my heart leap into my throat, but she was just straightening a crooked picture frame. Her footsteps moved on toward the laundry room. Arya opened the note in her lap, below the edge of the table. She read it without a single change in her expression. I suspected she had been practicing that skill for much longer than I realized. Watch her. Say nothing. She looked up at me and gave the tiniest nod a person could give. We worked through 2 more fake problems until Denise disappeared into the back of the house. As soon as the hallway was clear, I quietly told Arya that I needed her to do something much harder than just watch. I needed her to learn to look at things the way I used to look at the streets. The 38 years of delivering mail teaches you things that aren't written in any manual, I told her. It teaches you that if 3 days of newspapers are piled up on a porch, something is wrong inside. It teaches you that if a person suddenly starts locking a door they never used to lock, there's something hidden behind it, even if it's small. It teaches you that people lie easily with their words, but almost never with their habits. Faking a habit takes too much energy to sustain. I told her to look for the small details, where a person's words and their physical actions don't quite match up. When a person tells the truth, their hands are quiet. When they lie, their hands get busy with little movements. I told her to notice when her mother left the house and how long she stayed away. I told her to notice which doors Kelly kept closed, now that used to always stay open. I told her to notice who called the house and hung up without leaving a message, and whether her mother ever seemed surprised by a call she shouldn't have been expecting. I told her about Mr. Ellery Baptiste, 3 streets over. I delivered his mail for 20 years until he passed. One July, his mailbox went untouched for 3 full days, completely out of character. When I mentioned it to his daughter at the end of my route, she drove over that evening and found him on the kitchen floor. He was alive, but he'd fallen 2 days prior and couldn't reach the phone. No one else on the block had noticed anything amiss. I noticed because I'd trained myself to look for the patterns most people walk right past. Arya listened the way she used to listen to Odessa's old stories, on the porch swing when she was little, motionless, drinking in every word as if she intended to keep them forever. I told her about the phone call I'd overheard through the wall, the 4 words that had been following me all day. He still doesn't know. She frowned, turning the phrase over in her mind the way I had for days. She asked me who I thought the he in that sentence could be. I told her I didn't know yet, but that those 4 words worried me more than anything else that had happened since that Sunday morning outside Odell's house. She sat in silence for a long time, picking at the edge of her textbook page, before she finally asked the question I'd been waiting for ever since the night she first told me about the man in the parking lot. "Do you think Mom is the one behind this, Granddad?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not Dad, her." I looked at this girl I'd known since the day she was born. She was only 17, already carrying a weight no child should have to bear in the one house that was supposed to be her safest place in the world. I told her I didn't know the whole truth yet, and neither did she. That was exactly why she needed to keep watching and keep listening, instead of rushing to a conclusion before the evidence arrived. "Watch and listen," I told her, "and don't rush into trusting anyone completely right now. Don't trust your dad, and don't trust your mom." She watched me, waiting for the rest of the sentence to drop into the heavy air between us. "Don't even trust me," I said, "until you've seen enough with your own eyes to know for certain which one of us is telling you the truth." A few mornings after that conversation with Arya, a car I'd never seen before pulled into my driveway. It was black and freshly washed. Before I could even finish my coffee, a driver in a gray suit stepped out and opened the back door. Kelly met me in the kitchen, a packed suitcase already waiting by the front door. It was my suitcase, filled with clothes I didn't remember choosing and a few books I never would have picked for myself. She told me, using that warm voice she always used right before she took something away from me, that the house needed some serious structural repair work underneath the crawlspace. She said the work would kick up dust and mold spores, the kind of things someone my age shouldn't be breathing in for weeks at a time. She added that she'd already found a comfortable place nearby where I could stay until the work was finished. I asked her how long the work would take. She said she couldn't be entirely sure yet. Maybe a few weeks, maybe longer, depending on what the contractors found underneath. I didn't believe a word of it. I'd checked that crawl space myself 4 months ago and found nothing worse than the minor settling you get with any house that age. But standing in my own kitchen, looking at a suitcase I hadn't packed, I knew that arguing the point would only prove to any judge reading about it later that I was exactly the stubborn, confused, difficult old man they claimed I was. So I nodded. I thanked her for thinking of my comfort and asked for just a few minutes alone, so I could say a proper goodbye to my own house before getting into a stranger's car. She allowed me that much, at least. I walked slowly through rooms I'd walked through thousands of times, but I'd never really looked at them the way I did that morning. I ran my hand along the kitchen door frame where I'd marked Dante's height every year until he turned 13 and decided he was too big for it. I stood for a long moment in the bedroom Odessa and I had shared for 40 years, breathing in the trace of her that still lingered in the air, even after 6 years without her. I touched the brass handle on the front door, the one I'd installed myself, the very handle my hand had rested on the morning I found out what my family had done. With a cold, heavy certainty settling into my chest, I understood that I might not walk through this particular door again for a very long time, if ever. I also walked out to the backyard for a little while, just to catch one last glimpse of the garden Odessa had kept blooming, even in the final year of her life. She had insisted on planting azaleas along the back fence because she always said a house without flowers was just a box people happened to sleep in. Since I'd lost the patience to kneel in the dirt, someone had let the flower beds go a bit wild. But the azaleas were still there, still hers, and still blooming red against the wood, exactly the way she had planned. As I slowly made my way back around the house, Dante stood by the stairs, watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. It was somewhere between guilt and sorrow, but he didn't say a single word. He wouldn't even hold eye contact long enough for either of us to acknowledge what was actually happening between us. The drive to Magnolia Terrace took 25 minutes, spent mostly in silence. When the car finally turned into a long circular driveway lined with crepe myrtles, I understood immediately why Kelly had chosen this specific place for me to see first. It didn't look like a facility. It looked more like a hotel built for people who wanted to forget they were paying a premium to spend their remaining days in confinement. There were marble floors and fresh flowers arranged on a grand piano that nobody was playing. The woman at the front desk called Kelly by her first name, like the two of them had rehearsed this specific dance more than once before. Somewhere down a side hallway, out of sight, but just loud enough to carry, I heard a faint, raspy voice calling out for someone named Harold, patiently and without answer. Not a single person behind that beautiful front desk even looked up from their computer screen. They took me to a room on the second floor. It was bright, tastefully decorated, and smelled faintly of lavender instead of the bleach and boiled cabbage I'd expected. Kelly kissed my cheek, told me she'd visit real soon, and left. Dante followed her out, looking like a man walking slow toward a sentence. A staff member whose name I didn't catch showed me where the call button was, where the bathroom was, and told me dinner would be served at exactly 5 o'clock. Then she stepped back into the hallway, pulling the door closed behind her. A second later, I heard the lock engage automatically. It was a soft, official click, the kind of sound no ordinary bedroom door on Willow Bend Street had ever made in the last 38 years. In all those years, as a man who owned every room he ever slept in, I had been free to walk out whenever I pleased. I sat down slowly on a strange bed. Surrounded by unfamiliar furniture chosen by strangers to mimic comfort, I understood for the first time exactly how far they were willing to take this. Outside the window, past a courtyard fountain that sprayed water even though nobody was sitting nearby to listen, I could just make out the tops of the pine trees, lining the highway back to Carver Crest, back to Willow Bend Street, back to a house that didn't need a single day of structural work under the crawl space, and never had. Arya told me everything that happened that night afterward, first in pieces and then all at once. She said she waited 3 days to tell me because she had to turn it over in her own mind first. She later admitted that some part of her kept hoping she had simply misunderstood what she'd heard. She hadn't. Even now, thinking back on it, I find I can still hear the sharp outline of her mother's voice carrying through that closed door. It's like the way a person can still feel the burn on their hand long after the stove has gone cold. That evening, while I was being settled behind an automatic lock 2 towns away, Arya slid the small prepaid phone I'd given her into the pocket of her hoodie. She hit record exactly the way I'd shown her and walked toward her parents' bedroom on the pretext of asking her mother where the good scissors were kept. She never got the chance to ask. Kelly's door was cracked open a few inches. Through the gap, Arya could see her mother pacing beside the bed, her phone pressed tight to her ear. Her voice was low and fast, in a register Arya said she had never heard her mother use with anyone in that house before. Arya stood completely still in the hallway, one hand against the drywall, listening. Kelly was talking to Judson Woodward. It was clear from the very first words. "There's still a slight issue with the title search on the 4th property," Kelly said, her voice entirely businesslike, precise, and unbothered. "My understanding is that if there's any question of capacity at the time of transfer, these things can get held up in probate. So I need you to let me know the second your legal team has anything definitive, and then we can move. We're already behind the timeline I gave you." Then the tone shifted, the way it does when two people have handled the business side of things and are just reassuring each other over the details that keep them awake at night. "He won't be a problem," Kelly said, speaking with a casual disregard that bordered on boredom. It was the boredom of a woman who had explained the same thing 3 or 4 times already. "He's completely harmless, Judson. Almost sweet in his own miserable way. He truly believes that charging half of market value for those rentals makes him some kind of saint. It would be almost touching if it weren't so exhausting to watch. There was a pause while Woodward said something on the other end that Arya couldn't catch. Sentimentality, Kelly said, letting out a short, sharp laugh that held no warmth whatsoever. If you want my honest opinion, that's the problem with the whole street. They're all sitting in those little houses like they're monuments, instead of real estate that happens to be worth 4 times what it was 10 years ago. Men like him mistake paying off a mortgage for actually understanding money. He thinks being a landlord to a handful of retirees for 20 years makes him a businessman. No, Judson. It just makes him a very tired old man who worked his whole life and still can't tell the difference between truly owning something and merely having an emotional attachment to it. Arya said that standing in that hallway, she felt colder than she ever had in her life. Because that wasn't the voice of a woman worried about her father-in-law's safety. That was the voice of a woman counting down the days on a calendar. She told me her hands were shaking so badly that she had to press the phone tight against her thigh just to keep the recording steady. She was terrified that the slightest rustle of fabric would give her away before she could capture anything that mattered. Kelly was still talking, pacing faster now, saying something about how Dante was useful until the paperwork cleared, and how after that they would become, in her words, someone else's problem to manage. She used the word family, the way a person might name a competitor's product. It was a liability to be tolerated, not something to be trusted. Then near the end of the call, her voice dropped even lower, and Arya had to lean closer to the door just to hear. The old man built his whole identity on being a good person, Kelly said, a responsible man. Honestly, it's pathetic watching someone that age still trying to prove something to a neighborhood that left him behind a long time ago. Just make sure the filings on your end are airtight regardless. I don't need him understanding a single word of what's happening to him until the dust settles. The call ended abruptly. Arya heard the small electronic beep of the line disconnecting, and half a second later, the mattress springs groaned as Kelly swung her feet around toward the door. Arya didn't remember deciding to run. She just found herself moving. The phone was still recording in her pocket. She slipped across the hardwood floor and into the bathroom, just as her mother's footsteps reached the doorway behind her. She closed the bathroom door without a click, turned on the faucet to cover the sound of her breathing. She stood against the wall in the rushing sound of the water, the small second-hand phone glowing faintly through the cloth of her pocket. Still recording, still holding on to every word that had just been spoken on the other side of the wall. She stayed in that bathroom for 5 full minutes before she trusted her legs to carry her back to her room. Even after that, she told me she slept with the phone under her pillow that night, keeping one hand on it, the way a much younger child holds on to something that makes the dark feel a little less dangerous. The next afternoon, Arya drove out to Magnolia Terrace by herself. Technically, it was a drive she wasn't supposed to be making alone on the highway yet. But when I saw her face, I didn't have the heart to scold her. She looked like she hadn't slept a wink, and she hadn't. She didn't say much. She just reached into her pocket, pulled out a pair of small white earbuds, handed one to me, and kept the other for herself. Her hands were shaking so badly that I had to steady them with my own just to help her get the little things plugged in. My room at Magnolia Terrace faced east. The afternoon sun spilling through those tall windows was a soft, forgiving gold, the kind of light a designer probably picked out on purpose. Light meant to make everyone inside look a little more at peace than they actually were, but that warmth felt completely wrong for what we were about to do. I won't sit here and repeat every single thing I heard during those few minutes. Some of it I've already told you. Some of it I don't think I'll ever bring myself to say out loud to anyone, even tonight. A man has a right to keep at least a few wounds completely to himself. What I will tell you is what it feels like to sit in a rented room, in a borrowed chair, listening through your own granddaughter's earbuds, as your son's wife describes you as an obstacle rather than a human being. To be reduced to a line on a ledger by someone who has eaten at your dinner table countless times. Someone whose hand you've held at Christmas dinners and in hospital waiting rooms. There is a specific kind of loneliness in that. Even now, I can't say I've completely recovered from it, though I've had a long time to try. I didn't cry, I didn't yell. I just sat there perfectly still, my hands folded in my lap, the way I used to sit in church listening to those difficult sermons when I was a boy. I let every word land exactly where it was aimed. Because long before that recording ever reached my ears, I decided that no matter what it cost me, I was going to be the only person in this story who never lost his composure. When the audio ended, Arya pulled the earbud from her own ear and looked at me, waiting. She was wound tight, like a spring that had been stretched too far for too long. "All right," she said when she saw I wasn't speaking right away. "Now we go tell Dad. He has to believe us now." I told her no, not yet. She stared at me like I'd slapped her, and in a way I suppose I had. She wanted to know how I could just sit here after hearing what we both just heard, choosing to protect the very people who put me in this room in the first place. "I'm not protecting them," I told her. "I'm protecting your father from telling himself the easiest lie he'll ever tell." She didn't understand. I didn't blame her for it either, because it took me 76 years and a lot of wrong turns to fully figure that part out myself. "If we give this recording to your father today," I said, "he'll spend the rest of his life believing his wife did this to him. Just her and nobody else. He'll cry, he'll get angry, and in the end, he'll completely forgive himself. In his mind, he'll always be the one who was fooled, rather than the man who chose, time and time again, to look away from what he already suspected. I've spent a lifetime watching that boy run from the consequences of his own choices. Part of that is my own fault, for making things too easy for him when he was young and should have been learning how to handle a heavy load. I thought about the time he wrecked his mother's car at 17, and I had it fixed before Odessa ever found out there'd been an accident. I thought about the 3 or 4 times over the years I quietly paid off debts I'd somehow found out about, just to keep the peace, just to spare him from having to stand on his own 2 feet under the weight of his mistakes. She asked me softly what difference it would make if he found out on his own. "If Dante sees the truth with his own eyes, on his own time," I told her, "he won't be able to hand the blame off to anyone else when it's over. He'll have to carry it alone. That's the only door I know of that a man can walk through and actually come out better on the other side." Arya was quiet for a long time after that, turning the small phone over and over in her hands. When she finally spoke again, the fight had drained from her voice, replaced by something much heavier. "So we just wait," she said. "We sit on this, let him keep believing whatever he wants to believe about his marriage, and we wait?" I reached out and took her hand, the one still holding that dangerous little phone, and cupped it between both of mine. "Not forever," I told her. "Just until the moment does the work for us instead of us trying to force it." She looked down at our hands, then back up at me, her eyes bright but full of doubt. "How long is that going to take, Grandad?" she asked. "How long do we wait?" "Just until it's time," I told her. "I noticed Matteo Tran on my 4th day at Magnolia Terrace, but it took me another 2 days to find a decent reason to speak to him directly. That afternoon I was sitting in the common room, pretending to read a magazine that hadn't been updated since the spring. I watched Mrs. Okonkwo 2 seats over, a tiny bird-like woman who usually kept to herself, struggling to reach a water pitcher on a day when her hands clearly weren't cooperating. Patricia, the head nurse, a tall woman who always moved through the building like she was late for something far more important, walked right past Mrs. Okonkwo without so much as a glance, her eyes glued to her clipboard. It was Matteo who noticed. He was younger than I'd thought at first, maybe 23 or 24, with that tired look around the eyes I recognized from working double shifts for 38 years. He stopped the towel cart he was pushing, walked across the room, and poured the water himself. He knelt down slightly while he did it, so he could look her in the eye. He asked her something in a low voice I couldn't catch, but I could read the answer easily in the way Mrs. Okonkwo's face softened. She said something back, and he laughed. A real laugh, not the professional kind people in service jobs learn to use on difficult clients. For a second, the room felt a little less like a waiting room for the end of things. Nobody told him to do that, and nobody was watching to see if he did it, except for me. I decided right then that whatever Matteo Tran was being paid for this job, it wasn't enough. A young man with that specific kind of gentleness in a building full of people the world was actively forgetting had a reason for being there, and I wanted to know what it was. It took another 2 days before I actually got a chance to talk to him alone. He came into my room one evening to check the picture on my nightstand, and I asked him flat out how long he'd been working here. He told me a year and a half. He went to nursing school part-time in the mornings, working toward his degree. He was bridging the gap between financial aid and his actual bills by pulling afternoon and evening shifts at Magnolia Terrace, barely making it through one exhausting semester at a time. He told me his mother had worked in nursing homes when he was a kid, pulling night shifts in buildings just like this one, cleaning rooms for 20 years. He said he'd spent nights sleeping on a cot in the staff break room waiting for her shift to end, listening to residents down the hall call out for people who weren't coming. He told it all without a hint of complaint, like he was talking about the most ordinary thing in the world, completely unaware of how remarkable it might sound to someone hearing it for the first time. In return, I told him a little about myself. Not everything. Not yet. I told him I'd been a mailman on the east side of the city for 38 years. I've raised a son I still love, even if loving him has gotten complicated lately. And I told him I was fairly certain the people who put me in this room thought I'd be a lot easier to manage than I actually intended to be. Listening to his story felt like looking into a tilted mirror. I'd spent 38 years doing a job most people only notice when it goes wrong, delivering things that mattered to someone at the end of every stop. I was practically invisible to the people I served, except in the smallest, quietest ways. Mateo was doing the same work now, only harder, and for people whose time was running out instead of people just waiting for the next day's mail. Mateo didn't ask me to explain further, and I respected him for it. He just nodded. The kind of nod you give when you've heard enough of these stories in these rooms to recognize the shape of it without needing every single detail. "You seem a lot sharper than most of the folks on this floor, Mr. Pugh," he said, setting the pitcher down. "No offense to anyone else here." "None taken," I told him. "I've been working very hard to keep it that way in this building. If you could keep that fact to yourself for a little while, I'd take it as a personal favor." He looked at me for a beat longer than the sentence really required, a thoughtful, cautious look passing behind those tired eyes. Then he said, very quietly, that he understood a whole lot more than people in this place usually gave him credit for. I sat with that answer for a while, weighing it in my mind the way I used to weigh an overweight letter in my hands. It was that Thursday evening, watching a young man working his fingers to the bone for people the world had stopped looking at closely, that I decided Mateo Tron was exactly the person I needed on my side before this was over. I opened my mouth and asked him for the one thing I truly needed. I closed the door as far as the facility rules allowed, which wasn't all the way, and dropped my voice to a whisper. I'd weighed the request in my mind 1,000 times since that Thursday night, wondering what it might cost a young man who had already given me more kindness than he owed a stranger. "I need to borrow your phone," I told him. "Just for 1 minute, just to send one message to my attorney, and you can have it right back. I promise you'll never see me ask for this again." Mateo froze. His eyes darted almost automatically toward the small black dome of the security camera mounted in the corner of the hallway ceiling, just visible through my open door. That camera monitored everyone coming and going from this wing, though I doubted highly it could hear a word we were saying. "I could lose my job for this," he said softly, more to himself than to me. He told me the rules stated residents weren't supposed to have any unmonitored contact with staff, especially cell phones. It wasn't just privacy, it was liability. If a difficult family member complained, it wouldn't just mean this job. It would mean the references he needed for the nursing program he still had 2 long semesters to finish. I told him I understood all of that. I told him I wouldn't ask if I had any other way to reach the only person who could stop me from losing everything I'd worked my whole life to build. I told him it wasn't paranoia. I told him the court date was coming up fast, faster than anyone in my family expected me to be ready for. If the wrong people arrived at that hearing before the right paperwork did, an elderly woman named Odell Fairweather and 6 others on my old mail route would lose their homes, just like I'd lost mine. Mateo was silent for a long time. He looked out the window toward the parking lot. I wondered if he was thinking about his mother, working night shifts in a place just like this, watching things happen to people that nobody with the power to stop them noticed until it was too late. "One text," he said finally. "I'm giving you this one shot, Mr. Pugh. One message, and then this phone goes right back in my pocket, and we never speak of it again unless you bring it up first." Before I could even thank him properly, he slipped the phone into my hand. He glanced at the small black dome in the ceiling one more time, then shifted his weight half a step to the side, using his own body to block the doorway from anyone who might happen to look in from the hall. My hands aren't as fast on those kinds of screens as they used to be on a keyboard. It took me longer than it should have to find the messaging app and punch in Thomas Whitaker's number. It was a number I'd forced myself to memorize the same week I gave Arya her little phone, because I'd understood even then that a day would come when I wouldn't have a phone of my own to rely on. I typed slowly, checking each word twice, because I only had this one chance to get it perfectly right. I thought for a split second about all the other words I could have used. Softer words, ones that might have explained more or made Matteo feel less afraid of what he was doing for me. But I'd surrendered the right to soft words the day Kelly slid that folder across my coffee table. There was no time for anything now but the bare minimum of what needed to be said. "Activate the protection clause, Carver Crest." I offered no further explanation, and Whitaker didn't need one. 8 years ago, sitting across a conference table, the man had asked me just one careful question before agreeing to build a defense that most people would have called overcautious for a healthy old man. I told him then that if this specific message ever came to him at any hour from any number, he was to move immediately and ask his questions later. I hit send, watched the little indicator confirm it was delivered. Then, for the first time in weeks, my hands were almost perfectly steady as I handed the phone back to Matteo. He didn't even look at the screen before sliding it into his pocket. He gave a short, businesslike nod and pushed his cart right back out into the hall, as if nothing had happened in that room just a few minutes ago. Afterward, I sat alone in the sudden silence, staring at the empty dark where that small glowing screen had been. But I knew that on the other side of the city, a very meticulous man was reading those words. This was the beginning of the end of everything Kelly and Judson Woodward thought they had already won. I said a quiet prayer for Matteo Tran that night, the kind of prayer Odessa used to say for people whose names she barely knew, but whose kindness had crossed her path when she least expected it. Because whatever happened to my family next, I knew I'd just asked a young man already carrying a heavy load to carry a little bit of mine. And he did it anyway, for reasons that had nothing to do with whether I could ever repay him. Dante told me all of this later, with more details than I ever wanted to know. But I'm putting it here because you can't understand how a son could turn on his own father without understanding exactly what was running through his mind during the hour before he picked up the pen. He was sitting alone in the little office off the garage, a room he'd converted himself out of pride, during a year when he thought his house-flipping business was finally going to make him a success. He sat in the dark because he said it somehow made the numbers on his laptop screen easier to look at. $230,000. That was the number staring back at him that night, the total of a bad construction loan on a property he'd bought 2 years ago. He'd been convinced he could turn it around in 4 months for a clean profit, only to find out, after the drywall was up and the buyers were lined up, that the foundation had been failing long before he ever signed the deed. The legal fees alone had eaten up most of what he had left. The interest on the remaining debt grew every single week. He said it felt like a slow, patient animal breathing in the corner of the room, even when he wasn't looking directly at it. He hadn't told me a thing when it happened. Not about the loan, the lawsuit, or the collection calls that started coming at odd hours from numbers he didn't recognize. He told me later that pride kept him silent, far past the point where sense should have taken over. The specific kind of pride that had convinced him at 22 that he could build a life faster and bigger than his father, a man who had spent 38 years being patient and ordinary with a mailbag. Kelly found him after midnight. She'd just come back from some meeting or another, still in her work clothes, though Dante told me later he never actually verified where those late-night meetings were taking place. She didn't raise her voice. She never had to. She sat across from his desk, slid a manila folder over, and told him, in the gentle tone people use to explain painful things to a child, that there was a way out that didn't involve losing everything they'd built over the course of their marriage. Your father's 4 houses on Willow Bend, she said. He's practically giving them away to people who will never truly thank him for it. Those properties are worth a small fortune on paper, just sitting there while we're drowning in real debt. If we asked him directly, he'd want to help. But you know how he is about that street. He'd find a reason to say no, the way he always finds a reason to say no to anything that would actually let this family move forward. Dante told me he sat looking at that unopened folder for a long time, his eyes fixed on a photograph on his desk. It was a picture of me and him on the day he graduated from high school, my hand resting heavy and proud on his shoulder, both of us smiling like fools, thinking the hardest years were safely behind us. He told me he thought about the summer I taught him how to parallel park. He remembered me standing in the driveway, showing a patience I rarely had with anything else. I told him then that a man's life is built one careful decision at a time, and that the fastest route between 2 points is almost never the one actually worth taking. He could still remember the exact smell of the vinyl seats in my old truck from that summer, and the steady calm in my voice even on the 4th or 5th attempt, when most fathers he knew would have been raising their voices. He thought about calling me right then, just to hear my voice, he said, just to ask me plain out if I would help him the honest way, if he just swallowed his pride and asked. He decided against it. Underneath all the fear and the shame, he said he already knew what my answer would be, and the weaker, more desperate part of him didn't want to hear it said out loud. When he didn't move, Kelly reached out and opened the folder herself, smoothing down the top page with one hand and turning it slowly so the signature line faced him directly. "It's just a formality, Dante," she said softly. "He won't even notice. By the time the loan is cleared, and once he's thinking a little more rationally about the whole situation than he has lately, we can explain it all to him on our own terms." She reached across the desk and covered his empty hand with her own, drawing small, soothing circles over his knuckles the way she used to when they were first married, back when Dante still believed every move she made was pure affection, without an edge to it anywhere. "I'm not asking you to hurt him," she whispered. "I'm asking you to save us." Dante picked up the pen from the cup on his desk. He told me later it was a pen that made him feel almost physically sick to look at. It was a college graduation gift from me, his initials engraved on the side in small, clean lettering. He'd been so proud to wear it in his shirt pocket once. His hand was shaking so badly that the tip hovered a full inch above the paper before he could bring himself to drop it. He set the pen down once, just to take a breath, then picked it up a second time before he could think too much about what he was doing. He practiced first on a scrap piece of paper next to the actual document, 3 times, then 4, trying to recall from decades of watching me sign birthday cards, permission slips, and 1,000 ordinary checks exactly how my handwriting sloped. He told me he still had an old birthday card from me tucked into his wallet. It was a card from years ago, containing nothing but my signature and a hurried phrase. He propped it against his laptop screen that night, studying it like a counterfeiter working on a masterpiece. He memorized the specific weight I put on the P in Pew, the slight hesitation where the pen always paused for half a second before the final G. By the 4th try, it looked like mine, so much so that later, when I saw it in an exhibit folder in court, seeing my own name written by a hand that wasn't mine gave me a strange, cold feeling of familiarity. Since I was a boy, every capital B I've ever written ends with a tiny flourish, a small upward curl at the very bottom. My own father taught me that decades ago, back when penmanship mattered to men who worked with their hands and wanted their names to look like something when they put them down on paper. Dante remembered that curl. He told me later it was the one detail he felt he'd gotten perfectly, but in the end, it was the exact detail that undid him completely. He finally took the real document, pressed his hand hard against the edge of the desk to steady it, and signed my full name on the transfer deeds for all 4 properties on Willow Bend Street. Slow and careful, barely lifting the pen between the letters, the way my own handwriting never really lifted at all. The office door was cracked open about 2 inches, just enough for a thin ribbon of yellow light to spill out onto the dark grass outside. And it was that narrow, deliberate line of light, rather than any sound, that first pulled Arya from her bed that night. Arya stood tight against the cold brick wall of the garage, hidden in the deep shadow of the side yard. She'd woken up from an uneasy sleep to the sound of whispering where there shouldn't have been any at that hour. Barefoot and not entirely conscious of what she was doing, she'd followed the sound out through the kitchen door. The concrete of the side yard was cold enough in the dark to make her catch her breath with every step. Somewhere down the block, a dog was barking at nothing, an ordinary sound on an ordinary night, completely out of place with the extraordinary, unwelcome thing she already half guessed she was walking into. She told me she almost turned back twice. On the third time, she was practically ready to walk away, but she thought of that little plastic flip phone hidden under her mattress and remembered my 2 words from weeks ago. Watch her. A strange calm settled in her chest, just enough to keep her feet moving toward that lit window instead of running away. She reached the window just as her father lifted the pen from the paper, letting out a long, shuddering breath. It was the breath of a man who had finally done the deed, after spending hours convincing himself he could live with the consequences afterward. Arya raised her own phone, her hand shaking almost as badly as her father's had a moment before. Carefully angling the lens through the slats of the blinds, she hit record. She caught the document itself, my name written by a wrong hand trying desperately to look right. She caught Kelly's face hovering over Dante's shoulder, a look of pure satisfaction that held no warmth whatsoever. And she caught Kelly's whisper, sharp and smug, as she slid the paperwork toward herself, saying just 3 words. There, all done. It was as if her husband had just finished a minor household chore, rather than committing a calculated major crime against his own father. She recorded her father sitting perfectly still, frozen for 11 long seconds, staring at what his hands had just done, until Kelly reached down and tucked the pages into a folder bearing the Judson Woodward corporate letterhead. Kelly glanced toward the window, just once, a brief fleeting look, her eyes narrowing slightly against the black glass. Arya felt a chill run straight through her. She didn't wait to see if her mother had actually spotted anything. Lowering the phone, she backed away from the halo of the window, step by silent step, not stopping until she was back inside her dark bedroom, with the door closed and locked behind her. Her heart was hammering so hard against her ribs that she could hear it over the sound of her own breathing. She didn't cry. Not yet, she told me. It wasn't until nearly an hour later that she buried her face in her pillow, weeping silently so her parents wouldn't hear through the thin walls. And what finally broke her wasn't the fear of getting caught. It was the sickening certainty that whatever her father had just done, some version of it had likely been brewing in their house for a very long time before this specific night made it real. Priscilla Odom, a clerk at the Harris County Title Office whom I still have never met, was the first person in the world to notice something was wrong with the paperwork that arrived on her desk that morning. She later told Whitaker, who told me, that the moment she punched in the parcel numbers, the system flagged the transfer immediately. It was a hard stop, she said, the kind she'd only seen a handful of times in her 11 years on the job, reserved for properties protected under very specific legal instruments. She called over her supervisor. Her supervisor made a call of his own. In less than an hour, the entire file was routed to the fraud desk, a department that usually doesn't get that much attention on a Tuesday morning. I learned all of this in far more detail than I ever expected when Thomas Whitaker walked into my room at Magnolia Terrace, without calling first, something he had never done in all our years of working together. He carried his own leather folder, wearing an expression I hadn't seen on his face since the week we buried Odessa. 8 years ago, Whitaker reminded me, though I didn't need the reminder at all, you and Quentin sat at your old dining table and built a mechanism that most people would have called overcautious for a healthy man in his 60s. We placed all 4 of your Willow Bend properties into an irrevocable community land trust, with Quentin and Reverend Emmanuel Ross from Mount Zion listed as independent co-trustees alongside you. There was a very specific clause in that trust text. If you were ever declared mentally incapable or incompetent by any court, control of the trust wouldn't automatically pass to a family member. It would immediately and irrevocably transfer to the independent co-trustees named in the document. He told me that the exact moment Dante and Kelly filed for conservatorship, claiming I was no longer capable of managing my own affairs, they had unwittingly triggered that exact clause. The trust locked down automatically that very afternoon. From that moment on, any deed, any transfer, any attempted signature regarding those 4 houses was automatically flagged for review by the county. Whether my family understood it or not, it meant, as Whitaker put it, when your son walked into the county office yesterday morning with a forged quitclaim deed, he wasn't just committing forgery. He was attempting to transfer trust property that legally passed out of his reach weeks ago, the exact moment he tried to prove to a judge that you weren't fit to hold it yourself. I sat in silence for a long time, turning the shape of it over in my mind the way I used to weigh an overweight letter. They had built their entire case on my incompetence, and my incompetence on paper, by their own hand, was the exact mechanism that slammed the door shut right in their faces. I thought about Quentin's voice on that midnight call weeks ago, asking me plain out if I was sure, warning me that once we pulled this specific trigger, there would be no quiet way to walk it back. I thought about sitting at that dining table with Whitaker 8 years ago while Odessa's heart was already starting to fail in the next room. The 2 of us had been so afraid of a morning like this one that we built a wall. Neither of us truly believed I'd lived long enough to need. Whitaker told me the county was already coordinating with the district attorney's office. Biometric handwriting analysis comparing the filed deeds against dozens of documents I'd actually signed over the decades would take investigators about a day to confirm what we already knew. Forgery, attempted transfer of trust property under false pretenses, depending on how deep anyone wanted to look, potential conspiracy charges. Dante learned all of this an hour before I did, from his family attorney, Colby Reyes, a nervous young guy Kelly had hired months ago. Dante said later that Reyes's voice on that call sounded more frightened than any grown man he'd ever heard in his life. "Mr. Pugh," Reyes had said, his voice tight and clipped, "you need to understand that this isn't a clerical error we can quietly fix. At the time of the attempted transfer, these properties were already locked under an existing trust instrument. Whoever signed that document is looking at felony forgery charges. I need you to tell me right now, clearly on this line, is that your signature?" Dante told me he sat in absolute silence, letting a full minute pass before he finally answered, a silence that was more than enough to tell Reyes exactly what had happened in that garage office 2 nights before. He hung up the phone with hands that wouldn't stop shaking and started moving through the house, room by room, looking for Kelly. Like a man looking for a house he was only now realizing he never really knew at all. Half her closet was empty. A wheeled suitcase that normally sat in the garage was gone. Her passport, the one Dante used to tease her about keeping in a fireproof lockbox under the bed, like an international spy, was gone with it. The small box had been left open and empty on the closet floor. She wouldn't answer his calls. She wouldn't reply to his texts, each one growing shorter and more desperate until around noon, when the messages stopped delivering altogether. Her number had blocked him completely. Dante told me he stood alone in the middle of that half-empty closet for a long time, holding an empty fireproof box, finally understanding a full day too late what kind of woman he'd built his crumbling life around. I wasn't in that hotel room, and neither Kelly nor Judson Woodward sat down afterward to explain to me exactly how that conversation went. But between the phone logs, the depositions, and the specific details people let slip later when they were trying to save themselves before a judge, there is enough for me to tell you the shape of it now. She had checked into an airport hotel around midday, paying cash, using a name that wasn't quite her own, though it turned out to be close enough that it didn't fool anyone looking closely. The room was the exact, forgettable beige standard of every airport hotel, the kind chosen precisely because the people who check into them don't want to be remembered. By her own admission under oath later, she had changed her clothes twice, trying and failing to find something that felt right for a conversation she'd never actually planned on having without a ledger in front of her. She sat on the edge of a bed that smelled faintly of industrial laundry detergent, her passport and a stack of papers spread across the duvet. She called Judson Woodward's personal cell phone 4 times before he finally picked up on the 5th. "Judson," she said, and by every account I heard later, her voice had lost that warm, practiced calm she used with the rest of us. "We have a problem, a real one. The trust locked the properties down before Dante's paperwork cleared. There's a fraud investigation, and my name is sitting right on the edge of it, close enough that I need you to make some things disappear before anyone starts tracing this back to both of us." There was a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line. It stretched on for so long that Kelly later admitted under oath to her attorney she genuinely thought the call had dropped. She pulled the phone away from her ear once, just to glance at the screen and make sure they were still connected, her thumb hovering over the end button before desperation convinced her to keep listening. "We're partners in this, Judson," she said when the silence finally grew too loud to bear. "You told me yourself that we were building something together." "We were putting together a real estate transaction, Kelly," Woodward replied, his voice flat and unhurried, a calmness that should have terrified her far more than it did. "That is what we were building. I think you may have confused a professional relationship with something far more emotional than the circumstances ever warranted. And I'm telling you as a friend, that specific kind of confusion is exactly how people end up facing severe legal consequences." "I don't know what you expect me to do about a county fraud investigation," he continued, completely unfazed. "My name isn't on a single transfer document. My name isn't on any forged signatures. According to every official record, my involvement begins and ends with a single letter of intent sent by my company, an unsolicited inquiry of the exact same kind we send out quarterly to dozens of property owners as a standard business practice." She reminded him, her voice rising, losing its edge of control, about the phone calls, the meetings in the parking lot off Alameda Road, and the tight timelines he had personally urged her to meet whenever his investors grew impatient for the deal to close. "What I recall is a business relationship," Woodward said. "I don't recall anything that would withstand the scrutiny of a subpoena. I strongly advise you to start looking at this the exact same way before you say another word on an unsecure line." She asked him, her voice cracking for the first time since she'd picked up the phone, if he was really going to just sit back and watch her take the fall while he walked away completely clean. "I intend," he said, "to protect the Woodward Development Group the exact same way I protected it for 20 years. The same way I protected it through 3 separate lawsuits and a very messy corporate dissolution that never leaked a single word to anyone outside a small room of attorneys. If you'd like to discuss this further through the proper legal channels, you are welcome to call my office tomorrow morning." Kelly later told her attorney that she screamed his name one last time, sharp and desperate, before realizing the line in her hand had already gone dead. As for Woodward, according to the phone logs later submitted into evidence, he hung up that call and immediately dialed his own general counsel. It was an 11-minute conversation, and by the time it was over, every trace, every single indication anyone could ever find of communication between his office and Kelly Pugh had been quietly, thoroughly, and completely legally scrubbed from every server his company controlled. Whitaker later told me with a touch of professional appreciation that it was one of the cleanest pieces of corporate self-preservation he had ever witnessed in 30 years of legal practice. I think about that phone call sometimes, the two of them speaking the exact same cold, transactional language Kelly had used behind my back, describing a man she thought couldn't hear her. Only now that language was being turned right back around on her by someone who was a whole lot better at it than she was. I've come to believe there was a specific kind of justice in that, even if it took me a long time to see it, as anything other than one more ugly cost this ordeal forced us all to pay. Arya called me just a few minutes past 9 that evening. Before she even uttered a single word, I could tell from the sound of her breath that the house had finally broken, the way we'd been waiting for it to break for weeks. I was sitting in my room at Magnolia Terrace with an open paperback in my lap when the phone rang. The specific heavy rhythm of her breathing told me to put the book entirely aside before she even finished her first sentence. She told me she found her father sitting alone in the dark kitchen. He was still in yesterday's clothes, staring blankly at nothing at all. She said he looked like he'd aged 5 years in a single afternoon. The kitchen still smelled faintly of the coffee neither of them had bothered to drink that morning, the only light coming from the single dim bulb over the stove that had been flickering on and off for the better part of a year. He didn't ask about her mother. He didn't ask where she'd been all day. He just sat there. Arya told me she stood in the doorway for a long time, weighing everything I'd told her about, waiting for the right moment, until she finally decided that whatever the right moment was supposed to look like, a broken, hollowed-out father sitting alone in a dark kitchen was as close as she was ever going to get. She sat down across from him without a word. She placed the small flip phone on the table between them and hit play. I won't repeat everything that was on that recording. You've already heard the worst of it, just like I did. What I can tell you is what Arya told me about her father's face while he listened to it, because she watched him every single second, even when a part of her clearly wanted to look away. She said his expression didn't crumble right away. For the first 20 seconds, he just looked confused, as if his brain simply refused to take in the information. Then a coldness settled over him. Arya said it was a dead silence she had never seen in her father in her entire life. It was a stillness far more unsettling than the worst arguments that had echoed through that house all summer over money. She said it was the kind of quiet you imagine when a man gets a terminal diagnosis from a doctor. The specific kind of silence that comes when a person is doing a careful, quiet math on their entire life, and there's no gentle way to state the sum. He heard his wife call his own father a very tired old man who couldn't tell the difference between truly owning something and merely having an emotional attachment to it. He heard her short, sharp laugh at the very idea of being loyal to a block or a family, or anything else that couldn't be turned into a number on a spreadsheet. And then near the end he heard the words Arya had told me, the words that broke him completely, the words about how Dante himself would become someone else's problem to manage once the paperwork cleared. He didn't cry, even though Arya said she fully expected him to. When the recording ended, he just sat staring at the dark screen of that little phone for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was flat and quiet, a tone that scared her far more than any shouting ever could. "How long have you had this?" he asked her. She told him the truth. "Since that night in the office, before you signed anything." He asked her why she hadn't shown it to him sooner. Arya told me she gave him the exact same answer I'd given her weeks ago. "Because Granddad said you needed to see it on your own time, without anyone forcing it on you. Otherwise, you'd spend the rest of your life finding a way to blame it all on somebody else." He reached across the table and took her hand, the exact same way I'd taken it weeks ago in a rented room 2 towns away. He told her he was sorry. It wasn't the first time he'd said it that year, but Arya said it was the first time it actually sounded like it came from a place inside him that didn't have an hidden motive. "Dante sat like that for a long time," she said. Then he stood up slowly, walked over to the drawer where the charging cables were kept, and pulled out his own phone. For the first time in weeks, his hands didn't shake at all. He called Colby Reyes at 9:40 on Tuesday night. When the young attorney answered, sounding half asleep and entirely terrified by the hour, Dante told him something Arya said she'll remember word for the rest of her life. "I need to make a statement," Dante said. "All of it. Everything I did, everything she did, and every single thing I pretended not to know underneath it all. I'm done protecting the wrong people in this house, Colby. I'm completely done." After Arya hung up, I sat alone in my room for a long time, playing the entire evening out in my mind over and over again. I felt a weight lift from my chest for the first time, and I couldn't remember how long. It wasn't entirely relief, it was a specific kind of heartache. Watching a man, no matter how unsteady his steps, finally begin to walk toward the person he was always supposed to be. Nearly 3 weeks later, almost exactly 3 weeks to the day since the Sunday morning I'd first seen that moving truck, parked awkwardly outside Odell Fairweather's house. I walked into the Harris County Courthouse on my own 2 feet. I wore the charcoal suit I'd worn to Odessa's funeral, because it was the only set of clothes I owned that felt right for a day with this kind of weight to it. My hands didn't shake as I walked up the courthouse steps, though my knees were reminding me, the way they always do these days, that 76 years is a long time to carry around, no matter how straight a man tries to keep his back. I didn't use a cane. I didn't need one. I kept my head up and walked straight down the center aisle, and before I even reached the plaintiff's table, I heard the short, sharp catch of breath from the front row. Kelly was there, sitting next to a lawyer I didn't recognize. The federal marshals had found her 2 days prior in a motel outside Lafayette, paying cash for a room under yet another name that wasn't quite her own. She didn't look at me as I passed. She stared straight ahead at the empty space above the judge's bench, her hands gripped so tight in her lap her knuckles were white. Dante was at a completely separate table with his attorney, and when our eyes met for the first time in 3 weeks, he didn't look away. That alone told me more than anything Whitaker had told me to expect from that morning. Arya was sitting in the second row of the gallery, tucked between Quentin and Reverend Ross's wife, whom I didn't recognize until a moment later. Her chin was up, her eyes fixed entirely on the back of her father's head. It was the exact same patient look I'd spent weeks teaching her to use, turned now on the one person in that room who needed to feel it the most. Judge Diane Whitfield called the room to order, and Thomas Whitaker stood up to present our case. He moved with the exact same unhurried, meticulous precision we'd used to build every single piece of paperwork over the last 8 years. He presented the Community Land Trust to the court, alongside the automatic protection clause and the exact timeline of events. He proved that before any transfer was ever attempted, these properties had already been legally locked away. He produced the forged deed itself, and the biometric analysis confirmed that my real signature shared no common ground with the document they had filed. Arya's video from that garage window played without sound on the screens at the front of the courtroom. The entire room watched the hands of my own flesh and blood work against me, one cautious, deliberate letter at a time. Nobody spoke while that video played. I kept my eyes on it too, even though holding that gaze cost me something raw and real inside. Then the audio brought Kelly's voice into the room, filling the quiet space with words she never thought would travel past a closed bedroom door. I watched a few jurors who were sitting in the back for unrelated cases visibly flinch when her words about men like him echoed through the speakers. I watched the judge's expression go completely still and incredibly cold. When it was Dante's turn to speak, he didn't ask for leniency. He stood up, walked to the stand, and told the court the absolute truth, in a voice I hadn't heard since he was a boy, admitting he'd broken a neighbor's window. Everything he did, and everything he allowed himself to pretend he didn't understand. He described the forgery in plain terms, refusing his attorney's subtle attempts to soften the language for him. He described the pressure Kelly had applied, the folders she had ready, and the quiet certainty in her voice the night she told him it was just a formality. Not once did he say, "She made me do it." Several times, clearly and intentionally, he stated that the choice to pick up that pen belonged entirely to him. Kelly's lawyer objected twice. Judge Whitfield overruled him both times, her patience with that specific table visibly wearing thinner with each passing minute. When the testimony finally concluded, Judge Whitfield didn't take long to make her decision. She dismissed the conservatorship petition fully and with prejudice. She declared the Community Land Trust valid and completely intact, stating for the record that she found Mr. Pugh, meaning me, fully capable of managing his own affairs. She dryly noted that for a man who had just walked the full length of her courtroom without assistance, the fact shouldn't have needed stating at all. She ordered the county to immediately refer Kelly Pugh's case to the district attorney's office for fraud and conspiracy to commit forgery. She noted on the record that Dante Pugh's voluntary and full testimony would be weighed accordingly by that office against any charges he would eventually face himself in the coming months. Hearing that gavel strike didn't feel like a victory. Not the way I'd imagined it when I used to sit alone in that rented room planning out this morning. I looked across the courtroom at my son. He sat alone at his table, his hands folded in front of him just like Kelly's had been at hers. He looked back at me, calmly, for the first time in a very long time. In that moment, I didn't know if there was enough road left for us to find our way back to each other. I only knew that watching him hold my gaze without flinching was the first time since this nightmare began that my son was finally standing in the truth instead of running from it. It was 6 weeks after that Sunday morning outside Odell's porch. I stood in front of Odell Fairweather's door again, and this time, the key turned in the lock, smooth and easy, the way every key on this street was always supposed to turn. Before I could even finish knocking, Odell opened the door. She pulled me into a hug that smelled of cinnamon and mothballs, telling me she'd already heard the news from 3 different neighbors before my boots even hit her porch steps. The framed photograph she'd clutched to her chest on that awful Sunday morning was right back on the mantel where it belonged. She pointed it out to me intentionally, as if we both needed the reminder that some things really can be put back where they're supposed to be. Now, with Whitaker's careful help, the Community Land Trust has expanded. A small settlement fund that no one from our own family will ever see a penny of has grown the 4 houses into 11, absorbing 3 other small rentals along Willow Bend. The owners of those homes had also been quietly approached by developers, like Judson Woodward. During the months my trouble had briefly and uncomfortably become neighborhood news. Reverend Ross said, "We're the last block left in this part of the city where an old woman can afford to live out her days in the house where she raised her babies." I don't know if that's entirely true, but I know it's enough to keep me handling the paperwork every year without a single complaint. I drove out to the cemetery later that afternoon. Now that I finally have my truck back, I go most months. I sat with Odessa for a little while, telling her it was 11 houses now instead of 4, telling her about Arya's pre-law applications, telling her how it all played out. I don't know if she hears a word of what I tell her on the other side. At 76, I've decided it doesn't much matter whether she can or not. Some conversations are worth having, regardless of who's listening on the end of the line. A few Saturdays later, Arya drove me down the block for a ride. The 2 of us rolled slow with the windows down, and I found myself narrating the route out loud, just like I used to do when she was a little girl, riding shotgun in my real mail truck. It felt like a lifetime ago from a different kind of world. She starts her first semester of pre-law this fall at a school a whole lot closer to home than either of us expected. Around the 4th block, she told me she still wasn't sure if she wanted to be a prosecutor, going after people like Kelly, or a defense attorney standing up for people like her dad. I told her she had a few years left to figure that out, and that either choice would make her grandmother incredibly proud. At a red light, she reached over and squeezed my hand. It was the same gesture I'd started weeks ago in a rented room 2 towns away, returned to my palm. It felt like the best parts of a family, always finding a way to loop back around to where they started. Dante and I aren't back to where we were, and I won't sit here and tell you we're moving any faster than the truth allows. He calls most Sundays now. Sometimes I let it go to voicemail, not out of anger anymore, but because forgiveness is a heavy door. Real forgiveness isn't something that swings wide open all at once. It takes the width of careful conversations, one at a time, to push it open, just like any door ever gets moved, just like the whole story finally moves forward. 2 weeks ago, he asked if he could come over and help me clean out the gutters before the fall rain started. I told him he could. We didn't talk about Kelly's case, which is grinding its way slow through the courts, a room neither of us has any desire to sit in again. We didn't talk about the charges he's still facing himself. We talked about gutters and ladders, and the fact that I noticed his hands have finally stopped shaking altogether. At one point, balancing awkwardly on a ladder that was older than he was, he asked me, almost shyly, if I remembered the summer he turned 12 when I taught him how to use a level. I told him I remembered every summer, every single one, a whole lot better than he thinks. It's not the end of everything, but I'm beginning to believe that for right now, it's enough. Over the years, I delivered a lot of things to the people on this street. Letters, packages, and the occasional piece of bad news nobody wanted to receive. I understand now, in a way I didn't fully see before all of this happened, that the most important thing I ever delivered to them was simply the proof that someone was paying attention. The proof that someone believed a door worth walking through was a door worth protecting properly. It's a strange thing for an old man to learn this late in his days, but I've found the truest lessons rarely arrive on a timeline of your own choosing. If there's a lesson in any of this, it's to pay attention to the people who laid the groundwork for the soil you stand on. Protect the things worth protecting, even when it costs you your comfort, and even when it costs you the people you love. And don't ever let anyone convince you that sentiment and value are two separate things. Because in my experience, they've always been the exact same thing, just answering to a different name.